This holiday is a little complicated for me. I have an ancestry that was enslaved and am well aware of the struggle of my family and families like mine who saw in this holiday a great contradiction. And that's why I've called this sermon the Declaration of Aspiration, Hope and Hypocrisy at the nation's founding. I live in a community of 4 cul-de-sacs, about 90 homes. And I walk each of the cul-de-sacs and the street that connects all of them, and that's perfectly 1.1 miles. And I do that as often as I can. And as I was doing it yesterday, I had my earbuds in, and I was listening to Ossie Davis recite Frederick Douglass's most famous speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" And that's how I do my prep work. I'm walking, I'm listening, I'm learning, I'm getting ready, getting inspired. And it was just a really almost an out-of-body experience. As I'm walking along, and of course the neighborhood's mostly white, and many of the homes were festooned with flags and red, white, and blue, and some of my neighbors were out there, and I'm listening to Frederick Douglass in my ear, and I'm saying, "Hi, happy 4th, neighbor." Just walking around. So I thought, especially on the 250th anniversary, how do we responsibly celebrate and recognize the meaning of this day? And as I often say, it continues to amaze me how the lectionary, somehow without even thinking about it, this is a schedule of readings that were set years ago, that today's reading I found as the perfect reading for this occasion. I'll just repeat a few of the verses for our sermon. In Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 7, verses 8, 19, 22 through 25. "For I know the desire to do good lies close at hand, but not the ability. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. I delight in the law of God, in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law, at war with the law of my mind, making me captive to the law of sin that dwells within my members. Wretched person that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death? Thanks be to God, through Jesus Christ our Lord." So then, with my mind, I am enslaved to the law of God, but with my flesh, I am enslaved to the law of sin. This passage I found perfect because it aptly describes the human dilemma of obedience. We know what's the right thing to do, and if everybody did it, we wouldn't need stop signs or lights or police. We wouldn't need anything. But that's not what human beings do. That's not how we are. And Paul, I think, has really captured us in these few sentences in a magnificent way. And the other reason I think this passage is perfect is because at the beginning and the end, it talks about slavery. I am enslaved, is what Paul says. And in many of Paul's letters, his opening salutation designates himself as the sender, "I, Paul, a slave of Christ." Now, I know we're all of the generation that grew up reading the King James Version, And the King James Version would change the word slave to servant, because King James could not recite, nor could the nobles and the upper classes come to church and call themselves slaves. So they changed the word. There is no debate. This is not a scholarship question. The word in Greek is slave. But it was not fit for our sensibilities, so we changed it, made it a little more palatable. So I find that this passage fits this day in a miraculous fashion. The day is not the founding of our country, as many of the popular phrases will say. It is the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And for many of us who watched Ken Burns' magnificent documentary of 12 hours of the American Revolution, I was embarrassed about how poorly my historical knowledge was. I mean, in the popular mind, I'll say, the Declaration of Independence was written, war done, and we're on our way to be in America. No, I mean, in my mind, I didn't even realize that the Revolutionary War lasted as long as Ken Burns' documentary. But it lasted for years and cost thousands of lives. Brutal, bloody war was fought to get to this moment. Yet, whenever the Declaration of Independence is read, we are at once filled with awe and inspiration at the eloquent words and the powerful ideas there expressed, and a simultaneous confusion over how the founders who authored this document could also be enslavers, human traffickers. That's what they were. They were human traffickers of human beings. The Apostle Paul has written one of the most compelling psychological and spiritual assessments of the human condition ever penned. In these few sentences, he explains that conundrum that has plagued Adam and Eve's offspring since the knowledge of good and evil was disclosed in the Garden of Eden. This passage is perfect. This text is perfect for our reflection on the semi-quincentennial of our nation. Indeed, I have asked this question all of my life. How did they write this and live in immediate contradiction to these words? I am thankful now for the opportunity to finally find an answer I now offer to you. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. First, a few hidden facts. Hidden in plain sight, but not on the surface of the reading. The founders and authors of the Declaration, they were immediately aware. They were as aware of the contradiction between their words and their actions as we are today. I mean, for most of my life, I just thought that they, in fact, didn't see black folks as human, and that they saw no contradiction. But that's not the truth. And I'm glad to learn that. They were immediately aware of the contradiction. Now, it could only be a contradiction if they admitted in their minds that the Africans that they had captured, capitalized, commodified, trafficked, and enslaved were in fact human beings. While many would assert that Africans were an inferior quality of human beings nonetheless. That they struggled with the impact of slavery on their budding nation is clear from the amendments and the edits they made on the way to the final draft of the Declaration. I mean, that's the other myth. It was like they wrote it, boom, it was perfect from the first draft. You know, kind of like my sermons, you know? No, not that they're perfect, but 99% of my sermons are first drafts, FYI. Anyway, but to look at the process that brought this document to its perfection is extremely and very revealing. So, among our favorite and the document's most noble words, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and then the most curious phrase, the pursuit of happiness. Now, the words, the pursuit of happiness, were not in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. These words were not crafted by Jefferson. They were borrowed by Jefferson and borrowed from John Locke, the dominant Enlightenment philosopher of the day. And the words were substituted for another phrase or another word. This phrase was substituted for another word. And that original reading was inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. These noble ones were matched with a very mundane and, very earthy kind of concern. Life, liberty, and my money. That's what property. But the right to property, the right to private property, is a major category in Enlightenment philosophy. And it's that conflict of private property over God's realm that many of our native indigenous folks understood to be living on. They did not understand in the same way as these Europeans that you could own God's land. It was a thought that had not yet occurred, and that was part of that conflict. The pursuit of happiness was substituted for an inalienable right to property, which for many in that era meant the right to own human beings, the right to slavery, the right to be secure in your ownership of human beings, and that no one would alienate your property from you. That was in the first draft. And so this amendment was a very subtle amendment from those who looked on it from the outside. And thank God that they made the amendment. And there's some debate, but many scholars feel that the pursuit of happiness substituting for property was an anti-slavery statement, because those enslavers wanted that in the Declaration, and the abolitionists won out, saying, no, you are not going to mar our noble document with this horrible crime of slavery. And so they won that battle. But then there was a much larger amendment. And in fact, there was a wholesale excision of one of the crimes charged against King George. Now, we'll have the full reading of the Declaration at the forum, and you'll find that the Declaration is so much more than the preamble or the introduction. Its bulk is a list of charges against the king that justify why we are taking these extraordinary means to sever the ties from our motherland and set up this whole brand new nation. List after list and crime after crime in the list. And one of those crimes in the original draft was this: Jefferson charged the King of England with slavery. Jefferson charges the king, one of the charges was for his role in creating and perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade, which Jefferson describes in so many words as a crime against humanity. Quote, "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself," Jefferson wrote, "violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation hither." So right there in Jefferson's writing, he's saying these Africans are humans. It is a sin against humanity what the king is doing to them. And then here's the critical part. And this horrible crime against the African people that the king has committed, he has come and dumped it on us. And now we're laden down with all these slaves. Now, this charge against the king was, at the same time, a bit too much on the nose, a critique of slavery. Too much of an indictment of slavery itself. And so the slavery interests who were sitting at the drafting table said, that's very eloquent, Thomas, but no, we're not going to do that. And the entire paragraph of this charge was condensed not to a sentence, but to a phrase, charging that the king has excited domestic insurrections among us. Now, if you just read that phrase, you'd really like, what? Who? This was in direct reference to a 1775 proclamation. Now remember, while 1776 was the Declaration of Independence, there were skirmishes, there were casualties, there were battles prior to 1776 that led up to this. And in 1775, Britain offered freedom to any enslaved person in the American colonies, not the Caribbean colonies, in the American colonies, who would volunteer to serve in the British Army against the Patriots' revolt. That's what that phrase is referring to. The proclamation that they issued in 1775 inspired thousands of enslaved people to seek liberty behind the British lines during this revolutionary period that led to the Revolutionary War. That's what Jefferson finally charges the king with. Now, the most direct evidence of the founders' struggle with their hypocrisy about slavery can be found most simply by one of the most powerful figures of the era, Patrick Henry. We know Patrick Henry. What did Patrick Henry say? Give me liberty or give me death. And he writes to a friend of his who was a Quaker in Pennsylvania. And he writes to him and he says this: I shall honor the Quakers for their noble efforts to abolish slavery. It is equally calculated to promote moral and political good. Would anyone believe that I am a master of slaves by my own purchase? I am drawn along by the general inconvenience of living without them. I will not, I cannot justify it, however culpable my conduct. Let that sink in. And he's speaking for a whole class of folk, including Thomas Jefferson. Yes, the signers of the Declaration. Among those signers of this document, 48 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, or nearly 86%, directly profited from slavery. This is 7 more signers than previously known. These signers who directly profited, did not own, included Northerners and Southerners. This was not just a Southern thing. These signers directly profited from slavery either by enslaving black people, they might have traded enslaved people, bought and sold goods from enslavers that were produced by enslaved people, or supplied food and other provisions to the detention centers, the slavery camps throughout the Atlantic world. We know of Jefferson's own views against slavery from his writings. In his notes on the state of Virginia, he says, "There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us." Listen to this. "The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other. Our children see this," says Jefferson, "and learn to imitate it. The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances. With the morals of the people, their industry is also destroyed. For in a warm climate, no man will labor for himself who can make another man labor for him. Am I right about it?" He didn't say that part. He said, "No man will labor for himself who can make another labor for him." This is so true that the proprietors of slaves, a very small proportion indeed, are ever seen to labor. They never do anything. They don't work. They don't do anything. And y'all called us lazy. I'm sorry. Jefferson, "And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated, but with his wrath. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just." Here it is. Jefferson admits, as Paul had described 1,700 years before in his letter to the Romans, "So then, with my mind I am enslaved to the law of God, but with my flesh I am enslaved to the law of sin." Here is a truth so often overlooked. Slavery is an institution Slavery as an institution enslaves everybody. Yes, the burdens are inverse of each other, but as Jefferson iterates, a debauched character and spiritual demise are a high price to pay for convenience, as Henry had said. So, with a mind, America admits to nature's God and the God of nature that slavery is not natural, but only freedom suits the true purpose of every person, whether kind or clever. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist of African descent and runaway escaped slave. Frederick Douglass sees this dual impulse as well when he writes in his most famous speech, "What to the slave is your 4th of July?" He writes, "But I fancy I hear someone of my audience say, it is just in this circumstance that you and your brother abolitionists fail to make a favorable impression on the public mind. Would you argue more and denounce less? Would you persuade more and rebuke less? Your cause would be much more likely to succeed. Would you have me argue," says Douglass, "that man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him. What? Am I to argue that it is wrong to make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant of their relations to their fellow men, to beat them with sticks, to flay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them with dogs, to sell them at auction, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and submission to their masters? Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and stained with pollution is wrong? No, I will not. I have better employment of my time and strength than such arguments would imply. What then remains to be argued? Is it that slavery is not divine? That God did not establish it? That our doctors of divinity are mistaken? There is blasphemy in the thought. That which is inhuman cannot be divine. Who can reason on such a proposition? They that can may. I cannot. The time for such argument is past. Douglass goes on to say, though, the signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were, this is Douglass talking, they were great men, too. Great enough to give frame to a great age. I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes. And for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. Allow me to say, in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of this nation, I do not despair of this nation. I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. The arm of the Lord is not shortened, and the doom of slavery is certain. I therefore leave off where I began, with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men, and for the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. I agree with Frederick Douglass. Jefferson was a brave man. Jefferson had the courage to be convicted. No, I didn't misspeak. I didn't mean to say he had the courage of his convictions. For had he the courage of his convictions, he would have released all of those people whom he had enslaved. No, I say he had the courage to be convicted. Like Paul, Jefferson admitted that with his mind he agreed that all were created equal, but with his body and for his convenience, in his life, he was enslaved. He was enslaved to the sin of slavery. He was a brave man because he knew when he wrote these words that he was writing down his own indictment, right there for the world to see in the Declaration of Independence. And he knew in the moment that the ink dried that he was convicted. He was a brave man. Woe to us when we can no longer see right from wrong. Woe to us when we can no longer see that injustice is wrong. When we lose that moral compass, we have lost it all. We must retain the courage to be clear about where we have fallen short and where we yet must go. Now, I didn't confer with Josh on his children's sermon, but I have to say what I've written. They did not finish the building. They did not finish the building of freedom, but they did erect the scaffolding. And upon that scaffolding of liberty, up climbed the African, up climbed the Native American, up climbed women, up climbed gay and lesbian and transgender and bisexual and queer and every despised race and ethnicity, the Haitian, the Mexican, the Somali, the El Salvadoran, the refugees fleeing hunger, all have climbed the scaffolding of that liberty to find their freedom, to find their inalienable rights, to find, in spite of danger and devastation, and any and every other person who hears these words, whose soul stirs in response to the law of God that bestows upon us all life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so with Douglass, I agree. I do not despair of this country because we have made it this far, 250 years, and we have expanded the Charter of Freedom to more than were initially enrolled, and we shall continue to spread that freedom beyond our borders and hopefully be that shining city on a hill that lets the world know that this is the way God would have us live, as free, as independent, as morally courageous people who in their pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness will never fail to recognize the God of nature, and nature's God has created all of us equal. And to that I say, amen.